The laughter echoed across the shooting range like thunder. 23 law enforcement officers watched as I missed my fifth consecutive target, their snickers growing louder with each failed shot. Sheriff Martinez from the next county shook his head and muttered something about quotas and politics. But what they did not know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that every missed shot was deliberate. Every stumble was calculated. Because 3 hours later, when I walked them over to the far wall of the range, their laughter would die in their throats, and they would finally understand exactly who they had been underestimating all along. The badge felt heavier than I expected when I first pinned it to my uniform. January 15th was my first official day as sheriff of Millbrook County, and the weight of 3 generations of tradition pressed down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The previous sheriff, Tom Bradley, had held the position for 22 years before his retirement. His father before him had served for 18. I was not just stepping into a job, I was breaking a dynasty. My office still smelled like Tom's cigars and Old Spice cologne. The leather chair creaked under my weight, protesting this change just like everything else in Millbrook seemed to be doing. Through the window, I could see Main Street stretching out before me. The same hardware store, the same diner, the same faces that had watched this town remain frozen in time for decades. Deputy Rick Morrison knocked on my door frame. He was Bradley's right-hand man for over a decade, and the skepticism in his eyes was impossible to miss. "Sheriff," he said, the title sounding forced coming from his lips. "We have got the monthly reports ready for your review." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please, sit down, Rick. I want to discuss how we can work together." He remained standing. "Ma'am, I have been doing these reports the same way for 12 years. Sheriff Bradley never had any complaints." The first crack in the foundation appeared right there in that moment. Rick was not just delivering reports. He was drawing a line in the sand, establishing that things had worked just fine before I arrived. The message was clear. I was the outsider disrupting a system that did not need fixing. "I am sure Sheriff Bradley ran things well," I replied carefully. "But I would like to review our procedures to make sure we are following current best practices." Rick's jaw tightened. "Current best practices?" "Updated training requirements, evidence handling protocols, community outreach programs." He picked up the stack of reports and dropped them on my desk with more force than necessary. "These reports show we have the lowest crime rate in the region. Maybe the best practice is not fixing what is not broken." After he left, I sat alone in that cigar-scented office and realized I had walked into more than just a new job. I had walked into a war zone where every suggestion would be seen as an attack, every change as a betrayal of tradition. The men who worked under me had already decided I did not belong here. But I had fought harder battles than this. I had survived situations that would have broken most people. If Rick Morrison and the rest of the old guard thought they could intimidate me into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The first real test came 3 weeks into my tenure. A domestic violence call came in at 2 in the morning, and I decided to respond alongside Deputy Morrison. The caller was a woman named Sarah Chen, and when we arrived at her house, I could see the fear in her eyes before she even opened the door. Her husband, David, stood behind her with his arms crossed. There were no visible marks on Sarah, but I had seen enough domestic situations to recognize the signs. The way she kept her head down, how she flinched when he moved, the carefully rehearsed responses about falling downstairs. "Everything is fine here, Sheriff," David said before I could even introduce myself. "Just a misunderstanding between neighbors. You know how it is." I did not know how it was, and that was the problem. I looked at Rick, expecting him to take the lead, but he just shrugged. "Looks like a false alarm to me." "Ma'am," I said directly to Sarah, "can I speak with you privately?" David stepped forward. "Now wait just a minute. This is my house, and my wife does not need to speak to anyone without me present." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but Rick seemed eager to leave. He kept checking his watch and making subtle gestures toward the patrol car. Finally, we left without taking a statement from Sarah or documenting the call properly. In the car, I confronted Rick about his handling of the situation. We should have separated them for individual interviews. Standard protocol requires documentation even if no arrest is made. Sheriff Bradley always said domestic calls are private family matters. We are not marriage counselors. We are law enforcement officers, Rick. Our job is to protect people. He pulled into the station parking lot and turned off the engine. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you have been here 3 weeks. I have been handling these situations for 12 years. David Chen coaches Little League and volunteers at the fire department. Sarah Chen has never filed a complaint or asked for help. Sometimes knowing the community matters more than following every procedure in the book." But I knew what I had seen in Sarah's eyes. That was not the look of a woman who felt safe in her own home. Over the next few days, I made discreet inquiries around town and discovered that the Chen call was not unusual. There had been 3 other domestic incidents in the past year that were handled the same way. No reports filed, no follow-up investigations, no paper trail. When I brought this to the attention of the other deputies, the response was always the same. "That is not how we do things here. Sheriff Bradley trusted us to use our judgment. City procedures do not work in small towns." The breaking point came when I tried to implement mandatory body cameras for all patrol officers. The pushback was immediate and fierce. Deputy Morrison came to my office with a petition signed by all 4 patrol deputies, requesting that the camera policy be reconsidered. "The community does not want to feel like they are being watched," he explained. "It will damage the trust we have built over the years." I realized then that the problem was not just resistance to change. The problem was that my deputies had been operating without oversight or accountability for so long that they saw any attempt at proper procedure as a personal attack. They had created their own system of justice, and I was threatening to expose it. That night I sat in my kitchen and wondered if I had made a mistake accepting this position. The phone rang, breaking my thoughts. It was Sarah Chen. "Sheriff," she whispered, "I need help, but I cannot talk long." The monthly inter-department shooting competition was a tradition dating back 15 years. Every February, law enforcement officers from 5 counties gathered at the regional range to compete in various shooting disciplines. It was supposed to build camaraderie and maintain skills, but I quickly realized it was more about establishing pecking order. Sheriff Martinez from Oakwood County approached me as I was checking in. Well, the new sheriff wants to play with the big boys." His tone was friendly enough, but there was an edge underneath that made my skin crawl. "I thought it would be good to participate," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Good for you, sweetheart. Takes guts to put yourself out there." The word "sweetheart" hit me like a slap, but I forced myself to smile. 23 officers were watching this interaction, and I knew my response would be analyzed and discussed for weeks to come. The competition began with handgun accuracy at 25 yards. I had deliberately chosen to use my service weapon rather than bringing my personal firearms. I wanted to appear as ordinary as possible, just another small-town sheriff trying to fit in with the boys. My first shot missed the target completely. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. My second shot hit the outer ring, earning some sympathetic head shakes. By my fifth shot, when I missed the paper again, the laughter was open and unrestrained. "Maybe we should move the target closer," Sheriff Martinez called out, triggering another wave of laughter. Deputy Morrison stood behind me with his arms crossed, his embarrassment obvious. "Sheriff," he whispered, "maybe you should call it a day." But I continued shooting, missing more often than hitting, each failure adding fuel to the fire of their amusement. The other competitors began offering unsolicited advice, their voices dripping with condescension. "Try holding it steady, honey. Remember to breathe before you squeeze. Maybe you need glasses." The worst part was not the laughter or the comments. The worst part was seeing the look in my own deputy's eyes. They were ashamed to work for me. In that moment, I had become the weak link that diminished their reputation in front of their peers. Sheriff Martinez patted me on the shoulder after the competition ended. "Do not worry about it, Karen. Shooting is not for everyone. You stick to the administrative side of law enforcement." As I packed up my gear, I overheard conversations around me. How did she even get elected? Political correctness run amok. Bradley must be rolling over in his grave. Actually, Bradley was still alive and living in Florida, but the sentiment was clear. The drive back to Millbrook was the longest 45 minutes of my life. Deputy Morrison sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window without saying a word. The silence was more devastating than any criticism he could have voiced. That evening, the story spread through town like wildfire. By the next morning, half the county had heard about Sheriff Karen's humiliating performance at the shooting range. The postal worker smirked when I picked up the mail. The waitress at the diner took longer than usual to take my order. Even the crossing guard at the elementary school gave me a look that said she had heard the news. My authority, which had been shaky from the beginning, was now completely undermined. How could anyone respect a sheriff who could not hit the broadside of a barn? How could criminals fear someone who had been laughed off a shooting range? But what none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that every missed shot had been deliberate. Every stumble had been calculated. I had spent 12 years in the military, 8 of them as a designated marksman. I could put 10 rounds through the same hole at 300 yards. The question was no longer whether I belonged in Millbrook County. The question was whether Millbrook County was ready for who I really was. The aftermath of the shooting range incident was worse than I had anticipated. Within a week, my authority had evaporated completely. Deputies began ignoring direct orders, civilians started filing frivolous complaints, and the county commissioners called an emergency meeting to discuss my performance. The final straw came on a Thursday morning when Deputy Morrison openly contradicted me in front of a suspect we were questioning. We had arrested Jake Patterson for drunk driving, his third offense in 2 years. I was trying to get him to admit to having additional alcohol in his vehicle when Rick interrupted. "Jake, you do not have to answer that," he said directly to the suspect. "The sheriff is fishing." I stared at him in disbelief. "Deputy Morrison, may I speak with you privately?" Jake Patterson looked back and forth between us and started laughing. "Damn, even your own deputy does not respect you." In the hallway, I confronted Rick about his insubordination. "What you just did in there was completely out of line. What I did was prevent you from screwing up a case that should be straightforward. Jake Patterson is a good old boy who made a mistake. He does not need to be railroaded by someone trying to prove a point. He is a repeat offender who was driving drunk on a school day. He is a taxpayer who employs 12 people at his construction company. Sometimes the bigger picture matters more than the rule book. I realized in that moment that Rick was not just undermining my authority. He was protecting a system of selective enforcement that had existed long before I arrived. Certain people got breaks, certain crimes got overlooked, and certain relationships mattered more than the law. That afternoon, a serious incident occurred that required immediate action. A meth lab had exploded in a trailer on the outskirts of town, and there were reports of chemical exposure affecting nearby residents. This was exactly the kind of situation where strong leadership was essential. But when I arrived at the scene and began coordinating the response, nobody listened. The fire chief dealt directly with Deputy Morrison. The paramedics took orders from Sheriff Martinez, who had arrived from the next county. Even the state environmental team treated me like a bystander at my own crime scene. I stood there watching my county being managed by everyone except me, and I felt something inside me finally snap. The humiliation, the disrespect, the constant undermining had pushed me past my breaking point. I was tired of playing the role of the incompetent sheriff who needed help from the men around her. That night, I sat in my kitchen and made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out a bottle of whiskey that had been gathering dust in my cabinet and poured myself 3 fingers. Then I opened my laptop and began typing a resignation letter. But as I wrote, memories began flooding back. Memories of my time in Afghanistan, where I had served alongside men who respected my skills and trusted my judgment. Memories of the moment I decided to run for sheriff, believing I could make a difference in a small town that needed change. I deleted the resignation letter and started writing something else entirely, a plan. If Millbrook County wanted to see what their sheriff was really capable of, it was time to show them. But first, I needed to gather some information about exactly what had been going on in this department before I arrived. I finished the whiskey and smiled for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow, I would begin the most important investigation of my career. And this time, I would not be playing the role of the bumbling sheriff who needed help from anyone. I had never intended to hide my military background, but I had also never advertised it during my campaign. When people asked about my qualifications, I mentioned my criminal justice degree and my experience in law enforcement training. I rarely talked about the 12 years I spent in the Army, and I never mentioned the 8 years I served as a designated marksman. The decision to downplay my military service was strategic. Millbrook County was a conservative community, but it was also a place where people were suspicious of outsiders who seemed too qualified or too aggressive. I wanted to appear approachable, someone who understood small-town values and would not come in trying to militarize local law enforcement. But sitting in my kitchen that night, I realized my strategy had backfired spectacularly. By trying to appear harmless, I had appeared incompetent. By trying to fit in, I had made myself a target for every person who wanted to maintain the status quo. My phone buzzed with a text message from my former commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Webb. Saw the news about your shooting range performance. Are you feeling okay? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Long story, everything is fine. Karen, I have seen you put 20 consecutive rounds through a quarter at 400 yards. Either you are having a medical emergency, or you are up to something. Colonel Webb knew me better than anyone. She had been my mentor, my friend, and sometimes my conscience during the darkest days of our deployment. If anyone could see through my act, it would be her. I called her instead of texting back. Sarah, I think I made a mistake. What kind of mistake? I told her everything. The resistance from my deputies, the corruption I was discovering, the systematic undermining of my authority. I told her about the shooting range, about my failed attempt to implement proper procedures, about the moment I realized I was fighting a war with one hand tied behind my back. "So what are you going to do about it?" she asked when I finished. "I do not know, maybe resign, maybe admit I was not cut out for this." "Karen, do you remember what you told me in Kandahar when we were pinned down by sniper fire for 6 hours?" I remembered. It was one of the worst days of my deployment, when everything that could go wrong did go wrong. I said that sometimes you have to let the enemy think they are winning before you show them how wrong they are. And what did you do after that? I waited until dark, flanked their position, and took out 3 targets with 3 shots. So why are you not doing the same thing now? After I hung up the phone, I went to my bedroom closet and pulled out a box I had not opened since moving to Millbrook. Inside were my military service records, commendations, and photographs from my time overseas. There was also a letter of recommendation from Colonel Webb that detailed my marksmanship scores and combat performance. I had qualified expert with every weapon system in our arsenal. I had completed advanced sniper training and served as primary marksman for my unit. My longest confirmed kill was at 837 yards in conditions that most people would consider impossible. The woman who had been laughed off the shooting range was not the real Karen Mitchell. The real Karen Mitchell had never missed a shot that mattered. I spent the next 3 hours reviewing everything I knew about the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. I mapped out the relationships, the power structures, and the informal networks that really controlled how law enforcement worked in this town. I identified the key players and began planning how to gather evidence against them. But most importantly, I made a decision about how I was going to conduct myself moving forward. No more trying to fit in. No more playing the role of the harmless small-town sheriff. If they wanted to underestimate me, I would let them. But I would also use that underestimation as a weapon. Over the next few weeks, I would begin the most important mission of my life. And this time, I would be using every skill I had learned in 12 years of military service. The old Karen was done trying to prove herself. The new Karen was going to destroy them. My military training had taught me that the best intelligence comes from being invisible while your targets reveal themselves. For the next 6 weeks, I maintained my public persona as the bumbling sheriff who could not hit a target, while privately conducting the most thorough investigation of my career. I started with the financial records. Every small-town police department has budget irregularities, but what I found in Millbrook went far beyond normal accounting errors. Evidence room supplies that were ordered but never delivered, overtime payments to deputies who were not on duty, equipment purchases that disappeared into thin air. The pattern became clear when I cross-referenced the irregularities with Deputy Morrison's arrest reports from the previous 3 years. Suspects who should have been charged with serious felonies were being processed for misdemeanors. Drug dealers who should have been facing federal charges were walking away with local citations. The evidence was disappearing before it could be properly cataloged. But Morrison was not working alone. The corruption reached into the prosecutor's office, the county clerk's department, and even the local magistrate. What I had stumbled into was not just a few bad cops. It was a systematic operation designed to protect certain people while prosecuting others. Sarah Chen's situation finally made sense. Her husband David was not just a little league coach and volunteer firefighter. He was also a low-level drug distributor who had been paying for protection. The domestic violence calls were being ignored because David was part of the network. I began documenting everything with the precision of a military intelligence operation. I installed security cameras in the evidence room that my deputies did not know about. I recorded conversations using equipment that I had purchased with my own money. I followed paper trails and financial transactions with the patience of someone who had spent years tracking enemy movements. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Morrison had been using his access to law enforcement databases to provide information to criminal organizations. He was running license plates for drug dealers, warning them about pending investigations, and even providing details about undercover operations from neighboring counties. But the most damaging evidence came from Morrison's own phone records. He had been careless about operational security, using his personal cell phone to coordinate activities that should never have been put in writing. Text messages about evidence disposal, calls to known criminals during active investigations, and GPS data that placed him at locations where he had no legitimate business. I realized that the mockery and undermining I had experienced was not just about resistance to change. It was about fear. Morrison and his network were terrified that a competent sheriff would discover their operation and shut it down. Their attempts to discredit me were not personal. They were survival tactics. The most difficult part of the investigation was maintaining my cover while watching criminals walk free. Every day I had to pretend to be incompetent while people I should have been arresting continued their activities under my nose. But I knew that premature action would only result in evidence being destroyed and witnesses being intimidated. I had learned patience in Afghanistan, where rushing into an ambush could get your entire unit killed. The same principles applied here. I needed to wait until I had overwhelming evidence before making my move. By the end of March, I had compiled a case file that would have impressed federal prosecutors. Financial records, recorded conversations, photographic evidence, and witness statements that painted a clear picture of corruption spanning multiple departments and agencies. But I also knew that presenting this evidence through normal channels would be useless. The very people who should have been investigating this corruption were part of the network I was exposing. The prosecutor who should have been filing charges was on Morrison's payroll. The county commissioners who should have been providing oversight were benefiting from the status quo. I needed a different approach, something public, dramatic, and impossible to ignore or cover up, something that would force the entire system to confront what had been happening in Millbrook County. I began planning for a confrontation that would end this investigation once and for all. But first, I had one more piece of evidence to collect, something that would prove beyond any doubt that the laughingstock sheriff they had been mocking was actually the most dangerous person they had ever encountered. I called the meeting for 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, sending official notices to every county commissioner, department head, and elected official in Millbrook County. The subject line read, Sheriff's Department Performance Review and Future Planning. Most people assumed I was finally admitting defeat and announcing my resignation. The community center filled quickly. Word had spread that Sheriff Karen was going to address her failures publicly, and nobody wanted to miss the spectacle. Deputy Morrison sat in the front row with a satisfied smirk on his face. Sheriff Martinez from Oakwood County had driven over to watch the show. Even former Sheriff Bradley had flown back from Florida for the occasion. County Commissioner Janet Walsh called the meeting to order. Sheriff Mitchell has requested time to address some concerns about department operations and her plans moving forward. I stood up slowly, carrying a thick folder of documents and a laptop computer. The room fell silent, everyone expecting to hear my resignation speech. Instead, I began with a simple statement that changed everything. 6 months ago, you elected me to restore integrity to law enforcement in Millbrook County. Tonight, I am here to report that mission has been accomplished." The confusion was immediate. Morrison's smirk faltered. Commissioner Walsh looked puzzled, but I continued before anyone could interrupt. "Over the past 4 months, I have conducted a comprehensive investigation into corruption within multiple county departments. What I discovered was a criminal conspiracy involving evidence tampering, financial fraud, and obstruction of justice." I opened my laptop and projected the first document onto the screen behind me. It was a bank statement showing unexplained deposits into Morrison's personal account totaling over $40,000 in the past year. Deputy Rick Morrison has been selling information to criminal organizations and accepting bribes to make evidence disappear. He has used his position to protect drug dealers, domestic abusers, and other criminals who were willing to pay for his services. Morrison shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. She is making wild accusations because she knows she is about to be fired." I clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of Morrison meeting with a known drug dealer behind the Millbrook Diner at 2 in the morning. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. This photograph was taken by surveillance equipment that I installed after discovering irregularities in our evidence room. The man Deputy Morrison is speaking with is Tommy Valdez, who was arrested last month for methamphetamine distribution. The charges were reduced to simple possession after evidence mysteriously disappeared from our facility. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Morrison was turning red, his hands clenched into fists, but I was just getting started. The corruption extends beyond the sheriff's department. Prosecutor James Whitman has been dismissing cases in exchange for political contributions. County Clerk Maria Santos has been falsifying documents to hide financial irregularities. Even Magistrate Robert Chen has been involved in fixing cases for his brother David. That last revelation caused Sarah Chen to gasp audibly from the back of the room. Her husband David was staring at me with pure hatred, finally understanding that his protection racket had been exposed. I have documented evidence of every allegation I am making tonight. Financial records, recorded conversations, photographic surveillance, and witness testimony that will be turned over to state and federal authorities first thing tomorrow morning. Commissioner Walsh tried to regain control. "Sheriff, these are very serious accusations. Do you have any actual proof beyond circumstantial evidence?" I smiled and clicked to a video file. Morrison's voice filled the room through the sound system, clear as day. "Make sure that meth disappears before the state boys get here. We cannot afford to have Tommy talking about our arrangement." The room fell completely silent. Morrison looked like he was going to be sick. Several commissioners were staring at him with expressions of disbelief and disgust. "Ladies and gentlemen," I continued, "over the past 4 months, you have watched me fail publicly and repeatedly. You have questioned my competence, my judgment, and my right to hold this office. What you did not know is that every failure was deliberate. Every mistake was calculated. Every moment of apparent incompetence was designed to make you comfortable enough to reveal your true nature." I walked over to where Morrison was sitting and looked him directly in the eyes. "You see, Rick, I spent 12 years in the military, 8 of them as a designated marksman. I have never missed a shot that I intended to hit, and I have never failed a mission that actually mattered." The implications of that statement hit the room like a bomb. Everyone who had been at the shooting range suddenly understood that they had been watching a performance, not a failure. Tomorrow morning, federal agents will be arriving to begin processing the evidence I have collected. Multiple arrests will be made, and this county will finally have the honest law enforcement it deserves. I closed my laptop and picked up my folder. Any questions? The federal investigation moved swiftly once I turned over my evidence. Within 2 weeks, Morrison had been arrested along with 6 other individuals involved in the corruption network. Prosecutor Whitman resigned in disgrace. Magistrate Chen was removed from office. The entire power structure that had controlled Millbrook County for decades collapsed like a house of cards. Sarah Chen filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order against her husband. With the protection racket exposed, she finally felt safe enough to speak publicly about years of abuse that had been ignored by the very people sworn to protect her. Her courage inspired other victims to come forward, leading to additional arrests and convictions. The shooting range incident that had defined my reputation was finally put into perspective when I returned for the next monthly competition. This time, however, I brought my personal weapons and shot with the precision that reflected my actual abilities. 23 law enforcement officers watched in stunned silence as I put 10 consecutive rounds through the same hole at 50 yards. Then I moved to the 100-yard line and repeated the performance. By the time I finished demonstrating my capabilities at 300 yards, several officers were taking video with their phones. Sheriff Martinez approached me afterwards with a completely different attitude than he had shown during my previous visit. "Karen, I owe you an apology. I had no idea what you were really capable of." "Most people see what they expect to see," I replied. "Sometimes that works to your advantage." The wall of targets from that day became legendary in law enforcement circles throughout the region. Perfect groupings at every distance, demonstrating not just marksmanship skills, but the kind of precision that comes from years of professional training and combat experience. But the real victory was not in proving my shooting abilities. The real victory was in restoring integrity to a system that had been corrupted for far too long. Crime rates dropped significantly once criminals realized they could no longer buy protection from law enforcement. Community trust began to rebuild as people saw that justice would be applied fairly regardless of personal connections or financial status. I kept one photograph from that day at the shooting range on my desk. Not the perfect targets, but a picture of Sarah Chen's daughter playing safely in her front yard. That little girl would grow up in a county where law enforcement actually meant something, where justice was not for sale, and where domestic violence calls would be taken seriously. 6 months after the federal investigation concluded, I was re-elected sheriff by the largest margin in county history. The campaign was short and simple. My opponent withdrew after realizing he could not compete with someone who had literally rebuilt the entire criminal justice system from the ground up. The badge still felt heavy when I pinned it on each morning, but now that weight represented responsibility and honor rather than the burden of fighting a corrupt system. Millbrook County had learned that underestimating Sheriff Karen was the biggest mistake they could possibly make. And I never missed another shot that mattered.